Okay, so picture this. You're living at the absolute heart of a massive global empire, one that's growing faster than anyone could have imagined. And then you get tapped to answer the biggest question of all. Is any of this right? Is it moral? Well, today, we're going to dive into the story of a man who had to do just that. His name was Domingo de Soto, a 16th century thinker who basically became the conscience for an entire empire.
And you gotta understand, this wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. This question, by what right, was a full-blown empire-shaking crisis. I mean, as Spain was conquering the Americas, its own top thinkers back home were in a total bind. They had to face this incredibly uncomfortable problem head-on. How exactly do you justify conquering and ruling over millions of people? The whole soul of the empire was quite literally on trial.
Now, this whole crisis of conscience didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It had been brewing for a while. It really starts right after Columbus arrives in 1492 with all these reports of just brutal cruelty. Then in 1511, you have this brave friar, Antonio de Montesinos, who gets up and publicly rips into the colonists for how they're treating the native people. Fast forward to 1537, and even the Pope gets involved, officially declaring that, yes, indigenous peoples are fully human. So the pressure just keeps building and building until, get this, in 1550, Emperor Charles V does something absolutely wild. He presses pause. He halts all new conquests until they can have a proper debate about whether any of it is ethical.
And that sets the stage for the main event, the Great Valladolid debate. And look, this was not some stuffy academic conference. No way. This was a formal, high-stakes hearing where the entire legal and moral basis for the Spanish Empire was put under a microscope, right out in the open.
So you had two intellectual titans clashing over this. On one side, you've got Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. He's this brilliant scholar, and he's leaning heavily on the ancient philosopher Aristotle to make his case. His argument? That the indigenous peoples were slaves by nature, and so the conquest was actually a just war. Then, on the other side, you have the passionate friar Bartolomé de las Casas. This guy had been there, he'd seen the horrors with his own eyes, and he was a fierce, relentless defender of the liberty and the basic human dignity of all native people.
So, with these two clashing so hard, who could possibly mediate? Who could be the referee? Well, the emperor picked his man, Domingo de Soto. Think of him as the intellectual heavyweight of his time. He was a celebrated theologian from the famous school of Salamanca, a guy the emperor trusted completely. Everyone saw him as brilliant, but also fair. And his job wasn't to pick a winner. Nope. His job was to listen, to really understand both sides, and then summarize everything to help find the truth of the matter.
Okay, so this is where we really get to the heart of the whole thing. The single most powerful argument for the conquest was built on this one, deeply dehumanizing idea. And how Soto dealt with it? Well, it was absolutely crucial.
Sepúlveda's argument, when you really break it down, is pretty chilling. He goes all the way back to Aristotle and basically says, look, these indigenous people are barbarians. He argued they were more like animals than rational humans. And if that's true, he concluded, then it's not just okay for a wiser culture like Spain to rule over them. It's actually their duty. This wasn't some fringe idea. This became the core intellectual justification for the whole colonial project.
And this is where Soto's genius really shines. He doesn't just say, I disagree. He goes straight for the philosophical jugular. He argues that, yeah, slavery exists, but it's always conventional, meaning it's something created by human laws or war circumstances. It's not natural. His point was simple, but so powerful. No one is born a slave, period. In one sentence, he's making this incredible radical stand for a single shared humanity for everyone.
But what's so amazing about Soto is that he didn't come to this conclusion from a place of arrogance, like he had all the answers. Actually, it was the opposite. It was his deep, honest-to-God uncertainty that made what he said next so powerful. Las Casas, the friar, later wrote about how much Soto wrestled with this, and he recorded Soto saying something just staggering. When asked, by what right do we possess the transatlantic empire, Soto's answer was, in truth, I don't know. I mean, just stop and think about that. This is one of the smartest guys in the entire empire, the guy hired to find the answer, and he just openly admits, I don't know. That's incredible intellectual honesty. He just wasn't willing to sign off on an easy, convenient answer.
Okay, so if the whole slaves by nature thing is off the table, what about the other big justification? You know, the religious one, the mission to spread Christianity. Well, here too, Soto drew a really sharp and really important line in the sand.
His logic was just crystal clear. Step 1, yes, he said the church absolutely has a divine mission to preach the gospel everywhere. Step 2, that mission gives you the right to show up peacefully, to be present. But, and here's the giant but, that right to preach is not a right to conquer. It gives you zero justification for taking over, for seizing land, for imposing your own government. And his final point was non-negotiable. You can never, ever force someone to believe through violence.
So, what's the bottom line here? For Soto, it was completely unambiguous. You could not use religion as an excuse for violence. Period. Taking land and lives by force, in his eyes, was never justified. I mean, that's a direct shot at the entire conquistador model.
Now, you might think, okay, this is all about these huge, abstract, imperial questions. But the thing about Soto is that his sense of justice was incredibly consistent. The same ideas he was using to defend people an ocean away, he was also applying to the most vulnerable people right there in Spain.
In fact, years before this whole big debate, back in 1545, he wrote a major work defending the rights of the poor. He basically argued that poor people have a natural right to move around and ask for help, and he challenged all these local laws that were trying to restrict them. See? For Soto, justice wasn't selective. The same fundamental rights that belong to the indigenous people in the Americas also belonged to a poor person begging on the streets of Spain. It was universal.
So, what's the legacy of this guy? This man who dared to stand up and question his own empire from the inside? Well, it's a legacy that, honestly, is still incredibly relevant today.
I mean, think about it. By trashing the whole natural slavery idea, he was helping to invent the very concept of universal human rights. His arguments about the limits of a king's power, that's the early DNA of modern international law. He created this incredibly consistent ethical framework that applied to all marginalized people. But maybe most importantly, he showed that you could challenge the core ideas of colonialism right from the heart of the empire itself.
Really, Soto's great achievement was that he looked at the so-called common sense of his day, ideas about cultural superiority, about religious duty, about profit, and he had the courage to ask, are we sure about that? And that kind of leaves us with a challenge, doesn't it? What are the modern justifications for power, the things we take for granted today that we still need to question?